Welcome back. Now, today, Parliament's Portfolio Committee on Basic Education is expected to continue deliberating on the Basic Education Laws Amendment Bill. And this, of course, seeks to amend the South African Schools Act of 1996 and the Employment of Educators Act of 1998. Now, among other things, the bill seeks to amend certain definitions, also to make attendance in grade R compulsory, compel the registration of homeschooled learners, and criminalise parents who do not ensure that their child or children are in school, with fines or perhaps even jail time of up to 12 months. The bill has received mixed reaction from education stakeholders, including concerns that its intention is to take away the power of school governing bodies to some extent, and also to make determinations on language and admission policy, as the SGB is closer to schools and understands the unique dynamics within communities and the school. So to help us talk through some of this, we are joined now virtually by Professor Mary Metcalfe. And Professor Mary Metcalfe is Professor of Practice at the University of Johannesburg. Professor Metcalfe, good to have you with us once more. Welcome to Morning Live.
Thank you, Sakina. Good to be with you.
So, Prof, just diving straight into it, because this is very interesting at this point, and we've seen, there have been deliberations and stakeholder engagements in most of the provinces, I think, except for Limpopo and one other. I'll just check which other province that is, but I think the Eastern Cape, if I'm not mistaken. But most provinces have already had some form of stakeholder engagement. But what are your thoughts on the overall idea of revising some of these bills?
All of the issues that you've raised, to me, are interconnected in some way. And I want to start with the issue of compulsory education, because it's fascinating to me that this has become such a controversial point in the debates. You know, compulsory education, in my mind, is a pact between government and the community, society in general, to say that it is important that our children go to school. And compulsory education, across many countries in the world, it's part of the Sustainable Development Goals. And in Africa in particular, we've celebrated each time the compulsory age-going range is extended to make it more compulsory for more and more children, usually at ever-increasing ages. We have compulsory education in the law right from the passing of the South African Schools Act in 1996 or so. And it has always been that it is therefore the responsibility of the parents to make sure their children go to school, and it's the responsibility of the state to make sure that they provide places for children to go to school. This is something that we should hold dearly. Now, the consequence of making schooling compulsory for certain ages is therefore there must be a consequence for parents if they don't take their children to school. And the provisions for a fine, for imprisonment, have been there right from the beginning. Now, Sakina, why I think this is interesting in terms of the current debate is it may very well intersect with an increasing move towards homeschooling, and many families preferring, for different reasons which we can explore, to teach their children at home. The only change in the Basic Education Laws Amendment Act is also something we should be celebrating, I think. And that is that we've lowered the age of compulsory admission to not the year in which your child turns 7, but the year in which your child turns 6, which makes grade R now compulsory, which I also think is a good thing.
And I think it would be hard to argue against it being a good thing, Professor, but the question then remains whether our schools and whether the system is sufficiently geared up to accept these learners. And I know most schools do have the grade R already, but do we have all the systems in place? Do we have the necessary educators? Is everything in place in order for this to basically be solidified at this stage?
It's been interesting to see the growth in participation in grade R over the last 5 or so years. And we now have over 90% across all provinces learners attending grade R. Now, the more than 90%, I should have checked the figures before talking to you, but it's close to 96% across the country. Of course, that still means that there's a lot to be done to make sure that all schools have the classes and have the teachers. There's also issues to do with the conditions of service of the grade R teachers, because if it's compulsory, the grade R teachers need to be brought into the formal arrangements for employing teachers. There need to be the adequate funds to employ them, adequate funds to make sure that the classrooms are there in all of the schools. All of this is part of the work that lies ahead for the Department of Basic Education, to fund the provision of classrooms, the payment of teachers adequately so that we can achieve grade R for all of our learners.
And of course, the other point to that, Professor Metcalfe, is whereas, previously you would have had carers of children basically taking place of the earlier stages of early childhood development. It also means then, if this is now compulsory, that the teachers need to bring in a certain level of education as well. So how is that being rationalized in terms of bringing on board those who may not have the necessary qualifications as well?
So for grade R, there will need to be a push to make sure that all of the grade R teachers are teachers in terms of how teachers are defined in South Africa. But we need to make a distinction between the children coming into school in grade R at ages 5 and 6 and the early learning programs and centres before grade R. So those would typically be for children between the ages of 3 to 5. Those are likely to still be community-based, still likely to be lots of small centres where communities come together to ensure that their children have access to early learning programs in a setting where they also are learning to socialise, to be with a larger group of children than just being at home. So early childhood development is an critical part of what we need to do to support children. It means that between the age before birth all the way to 10, we need to understand that education starts in the home. It's closely associated with proper provision for health, for safety, security, for social support. Then it's moving into early learning programs, and we need to grow those across the country before entering formal education at grade R, when you are in the year turning 6, which means you would be between 5 and 6. This is a massive and wonderful development challenge for South Africa. We need to do more to take care of our children.
Indeed. And then, Professor Metcalfe, you touched on, compelling the registration of homeschooled learners, and I think that makes perfect sense for various reasons. So I don't necessarily want to belabor that one, because I want to come to the criminalising of parents who do not ensure that their child or children are actually in school. So what is envisaged here?
I really am finding this an interesting debate. I'm sorry I couldn't attend any of the provincial consultations, because I would have liked to have heard the objections. When the South African Schools Act was passed in the first term of government, I was always puzzled and curious about how we would enforce it. If you look at a country like the UK, England, Scotland, Wales, they have truant officers who go around looking and identifying children that are not attending school. We've never been able to put into place something as strong as a truancy officer. But in all countries that have compulsory education, there are consequences for parents if they don't send their children to school. Otherwise, what is the meaning of compulsory education? In a way, I think that this has been emotionalized in the debate to say now they're going to turn us into criminals if we don't send our children to school. But how does that become an issue? If parents are not taking absolutely the basic minimum care of their children to ensure that they go to school, they need support, they need help, but a willful refusal to let your child be educated is not good for society. So I need to understand the motivations for why this has become such an emotive issue. It puzzles me.
And as you say, perhaps if we had systems in place to help ensure that, we walk the talk in terms of compulsory education, that would also be of assistance. But Prof, moving on to the prohibiting of educators from conducting business with the state or being a director of a public or private company conducting business with the state. And one of the issues that's always come up that the public seem to, have pushed back against is that teachers, for example, during elections are used as electoral officers. So does that come into this particular provision?
I don't think so. When we run elections, it's a massive undertaking across the whole country. And there are very good reasons, I think, why we should be using educators as electoral officers, particularly because they're familiar with the community, they're familiar with the schools, which are often the polling stations. This provision, I think, is aimed much more at probably two things. Firstly, school governing bodies have huge responsibilities in terms of administering services for the school. You cannot have a teacher who's on a school governing body also being part of administering those services, because that's a clear conflict of interest. Secondly, there's the issue of teachers who, I think generally the public doesn't fully understand how hard it is to be a teacher and how much work is involved. So the question is it wise for teachers to be conducting business separately, and is it going to present a conflict of interest if they are on, if their school is doing business in a company in which they are involved? So again, it would be interesting for me to read the written submissions, of which there have been so many, to understand why this is an issue.
And then, Prof, giving government department heads power over language policies and the curriculum that a school adopts. And this, again, is also something that's caused quite a bit of consternation, because the communities, at least some of those that I've heard, and the SGBs feel that this is and should remain, their domain, because they are closer to the school and the community. What are your thoughts on this?
It is true that school governing bodies are closer to the community, but this is where we go back to where we started, that it is the responsibility of the state to ensure that all children get schooling. It's also in the interests of the state that we have strong governing bodies who take into account the needs of the community as a whole. I want to start at the level of principle. And the level of principle is that we have many communities which are not monolingual. It's in fact quite unusual to have a community that has only one language group within that. And, we often use the example of Afrikaans because this is where many of the legal challenges have over years originated from. But if we take an example of an area in the country where there are several language groups, it would be completely unreasonable for a school governing body to exclude language groups which are not part of the historic pool, if there are no alternatives for those children. So the state has a responsibility to say this school has capacity. It is not full in terms of the current language group served. So let's take a school on the border between Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal, which serves an isiZulu and an isiXhosa speaking community. You couldn't exclude children who are isiXhosa speaking in a school that's isiZulu medium of instruction if it meant that the isiXhosa children would not be able to attend school. Now, there also then becomes an onus on the state to make sure that there's the necessary resources and provision so that the school can cope with two languages. That would be part of the state's responsibility to ensure that all children have access to schooling. Does that make sense?
It certainly does. And I think, thank you so much, Professor Mary Metcalfe, for helping us, wade through some of what is intended with some of these amendments. And I think this will enrich the discussions going forward. Professor Mary Metcalfe, Professor of Practice at the University of Johannesburg, talking to us there about the latest developments with regard to the Basic Education Laws Amendment Bill. And of course, this will affect all of us, whether you have children, grandchildren, guardian of some children, it affects everybody in society. So let us know your thoughts on this.